The garage smelled of motor oil and time. 43 years of accumulated memories hung in the air like dust motes caught in the afternoon sun, streaming through the small, grimy window. I stood there among the boxes, holding a wrench that hadn't been used since Margaret passed, wondering when exactly my life had become this quiet. It wasn't the kind of quiet you choose. It was the kind that settles over you gradually, like snow accumulating on a roof. You don't think to check until something gives way. 3 years now since the funeral, and I'd grown accustomed to the sound of my own footsteps echoing through rooms that once buzzed with conversation, laughter, the gentle friction of two lives lived in tandem. The suburban house felt too big for one person, though Margaret and I had thought it perfectly sized when we'd bought it in 1987. 2 stories, 3 bedrooms, a kitchen with a breakfast nook where she'd read me snippets from the newspaper while I drank my coffee. Now I took my meals standing at the counter, the silence broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of settling wood. My son David called every Sunday at precisely 6 p.m. The calls followed a predictable pattern. "How are you feeling, Dad? Are you eating enough? Do you need anything from the store?" His voice carried that careful tone adult children use with aging parents, as if I might break if he spoke too loudly. We'd talk for exactly 15 minutes about nothing consequential: the weather, his job at the insurance company, my doctor's appointments, before he'd find a polite way to end the conversation. I didn't blame him. At 38, he had his own life to manage, his own apartment across town, his own problems I knew nothing about. We'd never been the kind of father and son who shared intimate details. Even as a boy, David had been reserved, thoughtful, the type of child who observed more than he spoke. Margaret used to say he got that from me, but I wasn't so sure. I'd always been willing to talk. David simply hadn't seemed interested in listening. The distance between us had grown wider after Margaret's death, not from anger or resentment, but from the simple fact that she'd been our translator. She'd known how to bridge the gap between his quiet nature and my clumsy attempts at connection. Without her, our conversations had become stilted, formal affairs conducted out of duty rather than genuine affection. Still, I trusted him. When he had offered to help sort through Margaret's belongings in the weeks after the funeral, I'd been grateful. He'd been methodical about it, packing her clothes for donation, organizing her jewelry for safekeeping, filing away important papers with an efficiency that had impressed me. I'd been too grief-stricken to pay close attention to the details. David had taken care of everything, and I'd let him. That Tuesday afternoon in October, I'd decided to finally tackle the garage. It had become a catch-all for everything I didn't know what else to do with. Christmas decorations I no longer had the heart to put up. Boxes of Margaret's craft supplies, stacks of old magazines and newspapers I kept meaning to throw away. The clutter had reached the point where I could barely fit my Buick inside. I'd been at it for 2 hours when I found the banker's box tucked behind my workbench. It wasn't labeled, which was unusual for Margaret. She'd been meticulous about organization, the kind of person who color-coded file folders and maintained detailed household inventories. The box was sealed with packing tape that had yellowed with age, suggesting it had been there for some time. I almost set it aside with the others destined for donation. Something made me hesitate, maybe the weight of it, or the way it didn't match the other storage containers Margaret typically used. Using a box cutter, I sliced through the tape and lifted the lid. Inside were files, legal documents, mostly, arranged in manila folders with labels written in Margaret's precise handwriting: property taxes, insurance policies, mortgage statements. Nothing unusual at first glance until I noticed a folder marked Cedar Lane Property. I'd never heard of Cedar Lane. My hands trembled slightly as I opened the folder. Inside were property tax bills dating back 15 years, all addressed to Margaret Patterson, her maiden name, which she'd stopped using professionally decades ago. The address was 1247 Cedar Lane, a location that meant nothing to me. The bills showed regular payments, always on time, for a property I'd never known existed. There were other documents in the folder: a deed, filed in '94, showing Margaret as the sole owner of the property, a homeowner's insurance policy listing the same address, bank statements for an account I'd never seen, showing regular automatic withdrawals for the mortgage, utilities, and maintenance. I sat down heavily on an old milk crate, the folder balanced on my knees. 15 years of financial records for a house I'd never heard mentioned, never visited, never even dreamed existed. A house my wife had owned, managed, and maintained completely separate from our shared life. The rational part of my mind searched for innocent explanations. Maybe it was an investment property she'd purchased without bothering to mention it. Maybe she'd inherited it from a relative and forgotten to tell me. Maybe it was some kind of business arrangement I simply hadn't understood or paid attention to. But even as I tried to rationalize it, I knew those explanations didn't fit. Margaret and I had shared everything: bank accounts, credit cards, financial decisions both large and small. We'd never made significant purchases without discussing them extensively. She'd consulted me before buying a new vacuum cleaner, for God's sake. The idea that she'd owned an entire house for 15 years without my knowledge was impossible to reconcile with the woman I'd thought I'd known. I pulled out my reading glasses and examined the documents more carefully. The mortgage had been paid off in 2003. The insurance premiums were current through the end of this year. The utility bills showed minimal usage, suggesting the house was vacant most of the time, but the accounts were active and up to date. Someone had been managing this property since Margaret's death. The thought hit me like a physical blow. All those papers David had organized so efficiently, all those files he'd sorted through with such careful attention to detail. Had he seen these documents? Had he known about the house all along? I tried to remember the weeks immediately following the funeral. David had spent hours in Margaret's home office, going through filing cabinets and desk drawers. He'd presented me with neat stacks of important papers: death certificates, insurance policies, bank account information. But he'd never mentioned anything about a second property. Could he have missed it? It seemed unlikely. David worked in insurance. He understood legal documents better than most people, and these weren't hidden or coded in any way. They were straightforward property records, filed away in Margaret's typically organized manner. The sun was setting by the time I closed the folder. I sat in the gathering darkness of the garage, surrounded by the detritus of a life I'd thought I understood completely. The Buick's chrome bumper reflected the last rays of light filtering through the window, and somewhere in the distance, a neighbor's dog was barking. I thought about calling David. The reasonable thing would be to pick up the phone and ask him directly if he'd known about the Cedar Lane house. Maybe there was a simple explanation. Maybe Margaret had mentioned it to him at some point, and he'd assumed I knew too. Maybe he'd found these documents and filed them away, planning to discuss them with me when the time was right. But something held me back. Maybe it was the careful way he had handled Margaret's affairs, or the formal politeness of our Sunday phone calls, or the growing distance I'd felt between us since the funeral, or maybe it was just the instinct of a man who'd spent 65 years learning to be cautious about the things that seemed too convenient, too neat, too carefully arranged. I put the folder back in the box and carried it into the house. In the kitchen, I made myself a simple dinner: microwaved leftovers from Sunday's roast beef, a slice of bread, and a glass of milk. I ate standing at the counter, as I had every night for 3 years. But tonight the silence felt different, heavier, charged with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. After dinner, I sat in my recliner and tried to watch the evening news, but my mind kept drifting back to the Cedar Lane property. Where was it? What did it look like? Why had Margaret bought it without telling me? And most troubling of all, what was David's role in keeping it hidden? The clock on the mantel chimed 9 times before I finally reached for the phone book. Cedar Lane wasn't listed in our local directory, which meant it was probably in one of the neighboring suburbs. I'd have to drive around and look for it, or maybe search for it online tomorrow when the library opens. But even as I made plans to investigate, a part of me wondered if I really wanted to know the truth. For 3 years, I'd been living with the memory of Margaret as I'd known her: devoted wife, careful homemaker, my partner in all the small daily negotiations of married life. The discovery of the Cedar Lane property had cracked that image, revealing fault lines I'd never suspected existed. What else hadn't she told me? What other secrets had she kept, filed away in boxes I'd never thought to look for? I turned off the television and sat in the dark living room, listening to the house settle around me. Somewhere in this suburban maze of identical lawns and driveways, my son was living his own quiet life, keeping his own secrets. And somewhere else entirely, a house stood empty on Cedar Lane, waiting for me to discover what my wife had hidden there. The loneliness I'd grown accustomed to felt different now, sharper, more personal. It wasn't just the absence of Margaret that filled these rooms. It was the presence of questions I might never be able to answer, doubts about the life I'd thought we'd shared. I climbed the stairs to the bedroom where Margaret and I had slept for 37 years. Her side of the bed still felt cold, even after all this time. But now, I wondered if it had always been cold, if there had always been a part of her that remained separate from me, housed elsewhere, filed away in folders I was never meant to find. Tomorrow I will drive to Cedar Lane. Tomorrow I will see what my wife has hidden from me. And maybe, if I was careful about how I approached it, I would finally understand why my son had chosen to hide it too. But tonight, I lay in the darkness and listened to the sounds of a house that suddenly felt less familiar than it had that morning. The creaks and settling sounds seemed different now, as if the building itself were whispering secrets I'd been too trusting to hear. Outside, the suburban night was quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional rustle of wind through the oak tree in our front yard. Normal sounds of a normal neighborhood, where normal people lived normal lives without secrets hidden in boxes or houses they'd never heard of. I closed my eyes and tried to remember Margaret as she'd been on our last anniversary, gray-haired and gentle, cutting roses from the garden she'd tended for 40 years. The image felt fragile now, like a photograph that might fade if I looked at it too closely. In the morning, I would begin to learn who she really was. And in learning that, I would discover what kind of man my son had become. The morning came too early, though I'd barely slept. I found myself in the kitchen at 5:30, going through the motions of making coffee while my mind churned over the documents I'd found. The automatic drip machine gurgled and hissed, filling the silence with familiar sounds that no longer felt comforting. I'd always been an early riser, a habit formed during 40 years of working construction. Margaret used to tease me about it, especially after I'd retired. "The sun's not even up yet, Frank," she'd say, padding into the kitchen in her worn blue robe. "What's the rush?" But she'd pour herself a cup anyway and sit with me at the breakfast table, sharing those quiet moments before the world demanded our attention. Now, standing alone in the pre-dawn darkness, I realized how much of our marriage had been built on these small, unremarkable routines. Coffee at 6, toast with raspberry jam. The morning paper spread between us while we planned our day. It had felt like intimacy then, this comfortable predictability, but maybe it had been something else entirely, a carefully maintained surface that kept deeper currents hidden from view. I pulled out the Cedar Lane folder and spread the documents across the kitchen table. In the harsh overhead light, they seemed even more damning than they had in the garage. 15 years of financial records, meticulously organized and completely secret. The mortgage payments alone would have represented a significant portion of our household income during those years. Yet, I had no memory of any unexplained expenses or financial strain. How had she managed it? We'd shared checking accounts, credit cards, even our retirement planning. I'd always handled the taxes, reviewed our investment statements, balanced our budget with the kind of methodical attention I'd once brought to construction projects. But somehow, Margaret had maintained an entirely separate financial life, and I'd never noticed a thing. The more I thought about it, the more I remembered small inconsistencies I'd dismissed at the time. The occasional phone calls she'd taken in another room, speaking in low tones about the property or the account. I'd assumed she was talking to her sister about their mother's estate, which had been settled years earlier. There had been shopping trips that took longer than expected, afternoons when she'd return home with fewer packages than seemed to warrant the time she'd been gone, business appointments she'd mentioned vaguely, never providing details I hadn't thought to ask for. Margaret had always managed our household finances with quiet efficiency. She'd paid the bills, balanced the checkbooks, filed the tax documents in neat manila folders labeled in her careful handwriting. When I'd shown interest in the details, she'd welcomed my involvement. But when I'd been content to let her handle things, she'd never pushed for my attention. It had been easy to trust her competence, easier still to let her shoulder that particular burden, while I focused on my work, my hobbies, the more visible aspects of maintaining our life together. Had she counted on that trust? Had she deliberately cultivated my inattention to create space for her secrets? The coffee had finished brewing, but I'd lost my appetite for it. Instead, I found myself pacing the kitchen, trying to reconstruct the financial landscape of our marriage. We'd always lived comfortably but modestly. I'd made good money as a foreman, and Margaret had worked part-time at the library until she'd retired. We'd saved diligently, planning for a retirement that would allow us to travel, maybe buy a small place by the lake. When she'd died, I'd inherited assets that matched my understanding of what we'd accumulated together. The house, our joint savings accounts, her modest pension, the life insurance policy we'd purchased when David was born. But now I wondered what else there might have been. What other accounts, what other properties, what other carefully hidden pieces of a life I'd thought we'd shared completely? By 7:30, I'd worked myself into a state of agitation that felt dangerous. My blood pressure medication sat on the counter next to the coffee maker, a daily reminder of my doctor's warnings about stress and its effects on men my age. I dry swallowed the pill and forced myself to sit down, to breathe deeply, to approach this methodically rather than letting my emotions run ahead of the facts. What did I actually know? Margaret had owned a house I'd never heard of. Someone had been managing that property since her death. David had sorted through her papers after the funeral and had never mentioned finding anything unusual. Those were facts. Everything else, the implications, the betrayals, the deliberate deceptions, was speculation. But even as I tried to maintain objectivity, I couldn't shake the growing certainty that David knew more than he'd told me. The image of him in Margaret's office after the funeral, working through her files with such careful attention, kept returning to my mind. He'd been so thorough, so professional in the way he'd organized everything for probate. Had he really missed a box full of property records? Or had he found them and made a deliberate choice to keep them from me? The phone rang at 8:15, startling me out of my brooding. It was David, calling earlier than his usual Sunday schedule. "Dad, I was just checking in. How are you feeling today?" His voice carried that same careful tone I'd grown accustomed to, but now I found myself listening for undertones, hidden meanings, signs of the guilt he might be carrying. "I'm fine," I said, surprised by how normal my own voice sounded. "Just having my coffee? Good, good. Listen, I was thinking about stopping by later this week. Maybe Wednesday? I could help you with some of those boxes in the garage if you want. I know you've been meaning to clean it out." The offer sent a chill through me. He wanted to help with the garage, the same garage where I'd found the Cedar Lane documents. Was this concern genuine, or was he worried about what else I might discover? "That's thoughtful of you," I said carefully, "but I've been making good progress on my own. Yesterday I got through quite a bit of it." There was a pause on his end, just long enough to seem significant. "Oh, find anything interesting?" The question felt loaded, though maybe I was reading too much into it. Just the usual, old tools, Christmas decorations, your mother's craft supplies. "Well, if you change your mind about the help, just let me know. I don't mind lending a hand." We talked for a few more minutes about inconsequential things. His work, the weather, my upcoming doctor's appointment, before he found his usual polite exit strategy. But the call left me more unsettled than before. The timing felt too convenient, his offer too specific. It was as if he knew exactly what I'd been doing in that garage. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the Cedar Lane documents. The deed showed the property had been purchased in Margaret's maiden name, something that would have required deliberate intention. She'd wanted to keep it separate from our shared assets, hidden from our joint financial life. But why? I thought about the woman I'd married in 1963. Margaret Patterson had been 23 then, a librarian with serious eyes and a shy smile who'd loved books more than people. She'd been careful with money, practical about the future, the kind of person who planned ahead and avoided unnecessary risks. When we'd bought our first house, she'd researched mortgage rates for weeks, comparing options with the thoroughness of an accountant. The idea of her making a secret real estate purchase seemed completely out of character. But people changed over the course of 47 years of marriage. The young woman who'd been intimidated by the loan officer at the bank had eventually become someone confident enough to manage complex financial arrangements without my knowledge. Maybe I'd been so focused on the Margaret I'd married that I'd failed to see who she'd become. Or maybe I'd never really known her at all. The morning stretched ahead of me, empty and filled with questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. I could drive to Cedar Lane, find the house, see what Margaret had hidden there, but something held me back. Not fear exactly, but a reluctance to cross a line I sensed would change everything permanently. Instead, I found myself thinking about David as a boy. 7 years old, maybe 8, helping me repair a broken fence in our backyard. He'd been so earnest about it, holding the board steady while I hammered, asking careful questions about the tools and the process. Even then, he'd been reserved, thoughtful, the kind of child who observed more than he spoke. "Why do we fix things instead of throwing them away?" he'd asked that day. "Because some things are worth keeping," I'd answered, "and sometimes fixing something makes it stronger than it was before." He'd accepted that explanation with the solemnity that characterized most of his childhood interactions. David had never been the type of boy who tested boundaries or challenged authority. He'd done his homework without being reminded, kept his room clean, followed rules with the kind of automatic compliance that had made parenting him almost effortless. Maybe that should have worried me. Maybe I should have wondered what he was thinking behind that careful exterior, what he was learning about the importance of keeping certain things hidden. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. Somewhere across town, David was getting ready for work, following his own morning routines in his own apartment. And somewhere else entirely, a house stood empty on Cedar Lane, holding secrets that were rapidly reshaping my understanding of the past 47 years. I gathered up the documents and put them back in their folder. Whatever I was going to do about this discovery, I needed to be methodical about it, careful, the kind of approach Margaret herself would have taken if she'd found herself facing evidence of deception. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was dealing with, and that meant finding Cedar Lane. I reached for the phone book again, this time looking for property records offices, real estate databases, anything that might help me locate the address. If Margaret had owned this house for 15 years, there would be records beyond what I'd found in her files. Tax assessments, utility connections, maybe even building permits or maintenance records. The investigation would take time, but I had nothing but time now. And if David was involved in hiding this from me, I wanted to know exactly what I was dealing with before I confronted him about it. The coffee had gone cold while I'd been thinking, but I drank it anyway. It tasted bitter, like everything else had started to taste since I'd opened that box in the garage. But I finished it, standing at the counter where I'd eaten my solitary meals for 3 years, and made my plans. Today I found Cedar Lane. Tomorrow I would begin to understand what my wife had hidden there, and why my son had chosen to keep her secrets. But first, I had to decide whether I was prepared to learn truths that might change everything I thought I knew about the people I'd loved most. The property records office downtown smelled of old paper and disinfectant. I'd arrived when they opened at 9, joining a small crowd of real estate agents, lawyers, and other people conducting the mundane business of property ownership. The clerk, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, had been helpful enough once I'd explained what I needed. Cedar Lane, you said? That'd be in Millbrook Township, about 15 minutes east of here. What's the house number? 1247. She had typed something into her computer, squinting at the screen through reading glasses that hung from a beaded chain around her neck. Here we go. Single-family residence, built in 1978. 2 bedrooms, 1.5 baths. Current owner, she paused, glancing up at me. Margaret Patterson, deceased. Says here the property's been in estate limbo since 2021. No active utilities, but the taxes are current. Estate limbo, that was an interesting way to put it. What does that mean exactly? Usually means the property's tied up in probate, or there's some question about the inheritance. Sometimes families can't agree on what to do with a place, so it just sits empty while the lawyers sort things out. But there hadn't been any probate issues with Margaret's estate. David had handled everything efficiently, filing the necessary paperwork, transferring assets, and closing accounts. Everything had been straightforward because everything had been jointly owned, or so I'd thought. The clerk had printed out a property information sheet for me, complete with a small map showing the location. I thanked her and left, spending the rest of the morning driving through Millbrook Township's winding suburban streets until I'd found Cedar Lane. It was a quiet neighborhood of modest ranch houses built in the late 70s and early 80s. Mature trees lined the street, their fall foliage creating a canopy of red and gold over well-maintained lawns and driveways. The kind of middle-class subdivision where people raised families and tended gardens and knew their neighbors' names. Number 1247, that's halfway down the block, distinguished from its neighbors mainly by what it lacked. The lawn hadn't been mowed in weeks, though it wasn't yet overgrown enough to attract official attention. The driveway was empty, the windows dark. A thin layer of fallen leaves covered the front steps, and the mailbox at the curb was stuffed with what looked like weeks' worth of accumulated flyers and notices. But someone had been maintaining the property, at least minimally. The landscaping, while neglected, wasn't completely wild. The gutters were clean. A small stack of newspapers sat neatly bundled on the front porch, suggesting regular collection. This wasn't a house that had been completely abandoned. It was a house that was being carefully ignored. I parked across the street and studied the building. It was smaller than our house, simpler in design, brick exterior, white trim, a small front porch with 2 concrete steps. The kind of place a single person might buy, or a couple just starting out. Not the sort of investment property Margaret and I had ever discussed, and certainly not somewhere she might have lived secretly. So, what had it been for? I was still sitting in my car, trying to work up the courage to approach the house, when a woman emerged from the neighboring property. She was perhaps 70, wearing a gardening smock and carrying a small watering can. She moved with the careful deliberation of someone managing arthritis, but her eyes were sharp and curious as she noticed my car. After a moment's hesitation, I got out and walked over to her. "Excuse me," I said, offering what I hoped was a friendly smile. "I'm Frank Morrison. I'm trying to find out some information about the house next door. 1 New 47, I think my wife may have owned it." The woman set down her watering can and studied me with the frankness of someone who'd lived long enough not to waste time on social niceties. "Your wife, you said? Not you?" "That's right. She passed away 3 years ago, and I'm just now sorting through some of her papers." "Well, that explains a few things." She extended a dirt-stained hand. "I'm Ruth Kellerman. I have lived here for 22 years. And yes, I knew about your wife, though I never met her personally." My pulse quickened. "She came here regularly?" "Oh no, hardly ever. Maybe 3 or 4 times in all the years I've been watching. But there was a young man who came by fairly often, especially in the last few years. Said he was managing the property for the family. The young man, David. Can you describe him?" Ruth tilted her head, considering. "Tall, dark hair, maybe late 30s. Drove a blue sedan, always very polite when we happened to cross paths. He'd come by maybe once a month, sometimes more often. Usually just stayed long enough to check on things, collect the mail, that sort of business." "Did you ever talk to him about the property?" "Once or twice. He said the family was deciding what to do with it long term. I got the impression it might be sold eventually, but there was no rush." She paused, studying my face. "You didn't know about any of this, did you?" I shook my head, not trusting my voice. Ruth's expression softened, with what might have been sympathy. "These family situations can be complicated. Maybe your son was just trying to spare you the extra burden while you were grieving." "Son?" She'd identified David without my having to name him. "How long has he been coming here?" "Oh, several years at least. Even before your wife passed, I'd see him occasionally, though it picked up quite a bit after 21. After Margaret died, when he would have taken over whatever arrangement she'd had in place." "Did you ever see my wife here, Margaret?" Ruth considered this carefully. "Like I said, hardly ever. But I remember one time, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, she came with the young man. They spent several hours inside and seemed to be going through things. I wondered if maybe she was getting ready to sell." 4 or 5 years ago. That would have been around the time Margaret's health had started declining, when she'd begun talking more seriously about simplifying our affairs, organizing important papers, making sure everything would be easy for David and me to manage after she was gone. Everything except this. "Mrs. Kellerman, what kind of condition is the house in? From the outside, I mean. Well maintained, considering it's been empty for so long. Your son does a good job keeping up with the basics. Lawn gets mowed when it needs it, gutters stay clean, no broken windows or obvious problems. Whatever the house is for, someone cares enough to take proper care of it." I thanked Ruth and returned to my car, but I didn't start the engine immediately. Instead, I sat and stared at 1247 Cedar Lane, trying to imagine Margaret there. What had brought her to this quiet street? What had she needed from this house that she couldn't find in our shared home? And what had David inherited along with the responsibility for maintaining it? The afternoon was growing late, the October sun casting long shadows across the suburban lawns. Other neighbors were beginning to arrive home from work, garage doors opening to admit sedans and minivans into driveways that looked exactly like the one at 1247, except those driveways weren't empty. I thought about driving home, putting this investigation aside until I'd had more time to process what I'd learned. But something held me in place. Maybe the same stubborn curiosity that had made me open that box in the garage yesterday, or maybe just the growing certainty that if I didn't push forward now, I might lose my nerve entirely. The key. There had to be a key somewhere. I thought about Margaret's key ring, the collection of house keys, car keys, and miscellaneous small keys she'd kept in her purse. After her death, David had returned her personal effects to me in a small cardboard box: her wallet, reading glasses, the jewelry she'd been wearing, and that key ring. I'd put it all away in her dresser drawer, unable to deal with the finality of disposing of items she'd carried every day. Had there been an extra key on that ring? Something I hadn't recognized or thought to question? The drive home took 20 minutes, but it felt much longer. My mind kept returning to Ruth Kellerman's description of David managing the property for the family. The phrase suggested an arrangement, an understanding, a set of responsibilities he'd accepted without ever discussing them with me. How long had he known about the house? Had Margaret told him about it while she was still alive, brought him into the secret as part of preparing him to handle her affairs? Or had he discovered it the same way I had, sorting through papers after her death, and made his own decision about what to do with the information? Either possibility felt like a betrayal, but in different ways. If Margaret had confided in him, it meant she'd trusted our son with secrets she'd kept from me for years. If he'd found out on his own and chosen not to tell me, it meant he'd been deliberately deceiving me for 3 years. Back home, I went straight to Margaret's dresser. The bottom drawer held the box of personal effects, untouched since the day David had brought it to me. Her wallet still contained the grocery list she'd written the morning she died: milk, bread, bananas, the mundane details of a life interrupted mid-sentence. The key ring was there too, brass keys dulled with age and daily handling, house key, car key, the small key to our safety deposit box, and one other, a newer-looking key that didn't match any lock I could identify in our house. I held it up to the bedroom window, examining it in the fading afternoon light. It was a standard house key, but the metal was brighter, less worn than the others, as if it hadn't been used as frequently, or as if it had been recently cut. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Margaret had carried a key to the Cedar Lane house on her key ring, alongside the keys to our shared life. Every day, every trip to the grocery store, or the library, or the doctor's office, she'd carried this tangible reminder of her secret. And after she died, someone had made sure that key found its way back to me, buried among familiar objects where I wouldn't think to question it. I sat on the edge of the bed Margaret and I had shared for 37 years, holding the key to a house I'd never seen her visit, trying to understand what kind of marriage we'd really had. The woman who had read me the newspaper over morning coffee, who'd tended her roses with such careful attention, who'd kissed me goodbye every morning for 47 years. That woman had owned a house on Cedar Lane and never mentioned it once. The bedroom felt different now, charged with questions that seemed to echo off the familiar walls. The dresser where Margaret had kept her jewelry, the closet that still held some of her clothes, the reading chair where she'd spent her evenings. Everything looked the same, but it all felt like evidence of a performance I'd been too trusting to recognize. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the suburban street in the golden light that had always reminded me of the early days of our marriage. But those memories felt unreliable now, like photographs that might have been deliberately posed to hide what was really happening just outside the frame. Tomorrow, I will drive back to Cedar Lane. Tomorrow, I would use Margaret's key to open the door of her secret house and discover what she'd been hiding there. But tonight, I would sit in this familiar bedroom and try to reconcile the woman I'd thought I'd married with the woman who'd carried secrets in her purse for 15 years. The key felt warm in my palm, heated by my grip and the weight of everything it represented. Such a small thing to change so much. But that was how secrets worked, wasn't it? They started small, manageable, easily justified. And then they grew in the dark until they became larger than the truths they were meant to protect. I put the key in my pocket and went downstairs to fix my dinner. Roast beef again, microwaved and eaten standing at the counter. But tonight the ritual felt different, like something I was performing for an audience that might have been watching all along. Tomorrow I would find out what that audience had been waiting to see. The key turned easily in the lock, as if it had been used recently. The door of 1247 Cedar Lane swung open with barely a creak, revealing a small entryway that smelled faintly of lemon cleaning products and something else, something that reminded me powerfully of Margaret's perfume. I stood on the threshold for a long moment, my hands still on the doorknob, struggling with the sensation that I was trespassing. This was my wife's house, technically my house now, but it felt like entering a stranger's home without permission. The afternoon sun slanted through the front windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the still air. The living room was simply furnished but comfortable. A beige sofa faced a modest television, with a coffee table holding neat stacks of magazines. Better Homes and Gardens, Reader's Digest, the kinds of publications Margaret had always enjoyed. The walls were painted a soft cream color, decorated with framed prints of garden scenes that looked like they'd been chosen more for their calming effect than any particular artistic merit. But it was the personal touches that stopped me cold. On the mantelpiece above a small electric fireplace sat a collection of photographs I recognized, but had never seen displayed this way. There was our wedding photo, the formal studio portrait we'd had taken in 1963. Margaret in her simple white dress, and me in the rented tuxedo that had felt so uncomfortable. Next to it was a picture of David as a toddler, maybe 3 years old, grinning at the camera from his perch on my shoulders during a long-ago trip to the zoo. And there were others, photos from family vacations, birthday celebrations, Christmas mornings, arranged with the same careful attention Margaret had always brought to decorating our home. But these weren't duplicates of pictures that hung on our walls. These were different shots from the same occasions, as if she'd been creating a parallel photo album for this parallel life. I moved through the small house like a detective gathering evidence. Though I wasn't sure what crime I was investigating, the kitchen was equipped with basic necessities, dishes for one, a few pots and pans, a refrigerator that hummed quietly but contained only condiments and expired milk. The bedroom held a double bed, neatly made, with a dresser that contained women's clothing I didn't recognize. Casual clothes, mostly, jeans, sweaters, comfortable shoes, nothing that matched Margaret's usual style. It was in the second bedroom, set up as an office, that I found what might have been answers. The room contained a desk, a filing cabinet, and bookshelves lined with photo albums and journals. But it wasn't the furniture that caught my attention. It was the walls. They were covered with photographs, dozens of them, arranged in a careful chronological progression that told the story of a life I'd never known Margaret had lived. The earliest photos showed her as a young woman, maybe in her 20s, standing with people I didn't recognize in places I'd never been. There she was at what looked like a college graduation, beaming beside an older couple who might have been professors or mentors. Another showed her at some kind of professional conference, wearing a name tag and shaking hands with a distinguished-looking man in a suit. As the photos progressed through the years, I began to see a pattern. Margaret at library conferences, at book club meetings, at professional development workshops. Margaret with colleagues whose names I'd never heard, in cities we'd never visited together. Margaret living what appeared to be a full professional and social life that had existed completely separate from our marriage. But it was the more recent photos that truly unsettled me. Margaret in this very house, sitting at the desk where I now stood, looking relaxed and happy in a way I hadn't seen in years. Margaret in the small backyard, tending a garden I had never known existed. Margaret with David, both of them looking comfortable and conspiratorial, as if they were sharing some private joke. The photos with David were numerous and recent. There he was helping her hang pictures on these walls. There he was painting the kitchen, his sleeves rolled up and a grin on his face that I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. In one particularly painful image, he was sitting beside her on the living room sofa, both of them looking through what appeared to be photo albums, his head bent close to hers in the kind of intimate family moment I'd thought we'd all shared together. But the most devastating photo was tucked into the corner of a bulletin board, almost hidden behind other images. It showed Margaret and David together at what looked like a restaurant, both dressed up, both smiling at the camera with genuine happiness. At the bottom, in Margaret's handwriting, was a date from just 6 months before she died, and a caption that read, "David's birthday dinner. So glad we finally have our place to celebrate properly." Our place. I sank into the desk chair, overwhelmed by the implications of what I was seeing. This wasn't just a house Margaret had bought and forgotten about. This was a refuge, a second life she'd constructed and maintained in secret for years. And David hadn't just known about it, he'd been an active participant in it. The desk drawers yielded more evidence. Appointment calendars showing regular visits to the Cedar Lane house, sometimes alone, sometimes with David. Restaurant receipts from places in this neighborhood, signed with Margaret's maiden name. Correspondence with local businesses, a cleaning service, a lawn care company, a handyman who'd done various repairs. all arranged under the name Margaret Patterson. She'd maintained a complete alternate identity, and David had been her accomplice. I found myself thinking about David as a boy, remembering the countless Saturday afternoons we'd spent together in our garage. He'd been maybe 10 the first time I'd let him help me rebuild a carburetor, his small fingers surprisingly deft with the tiny screws and gaskets. He'd asked careful questions about how engines worked, why certain parts fit together in specific ways, what happened when something broke down. "Dad," he'd said that day, his face serious with concentration, "how do you know when something's really broken?" "Usually it stops working the way it's supposed to," I'd answered. "Makes noise when it should be quiet, or goes slow when it should go fast. But what if it looks like it's working fine, but there's something wrong inside that you can't see?" Even then, at 10 years old, he'd been thinking about hidden problems, secret malfunctions, the difference between appearance and reality. "Well," I'd said, "that's when you have to pay attention to the small signs. Listen more carefully. Look for clues that something's not quite right." He'd nodded solemnly, as if filing this wisdom away for future reference. And maybe he had. Maybe he'd spent his childhood learning to detect the secret problems in our family, the hidden malfunctions that I'd been too trusting or too oblivious to notice. I found a photo album in one of the desk drawers, bound in leather, with Cedar Lane memories embossed on the cover in gold lettering. Inside were pictures spanning the 15 years Margaret had owned the house, a careful record of her secret life arranged in chronological order. The early photos showed the house as it must have looked when she'd first bought it. Empty rooms, bare walls, the stark functionality of a space not yet made into a home. But as the album progressed, I could see the gradual transformation. Furniture appeared, walls were painted, personal touches were added, and David appeared too, first as a young man in his 20s helping her move furniture, then increasingly as a collaborator in whatever project this house represented. There were photos of him painting bedrooms, installing shelving, helping her plant the small garden in the backyard. In many of the pictures, both he and Margaret looked happier, more relaxed, than I remembered seeing them during the corresponding years of our family life. Had our home felt like a burden to them? Had the life we'd built together become something they needed to escape from? I closed the album and sat in the quiet office, surrounded by evidence of a relationship between my wife and son that had existed without my knowledge for years. The late afternoon sun was slanting lower through the windows, casting long shadows across the photographs that documented their shared conspiracy. It wasn't just the house that hurt. It was the joy I saw in their faces in these pictures, the ease and intimacy that suggested this secret arrangement had been a source of happiness rather than guilt. They hadn't been reluctantly keeping something from me. They'd been actively enjoying something I wasn't part of. The hardest photo to look at was one near the end of the album, taken maybe a year before Margaret died. She was sitting in the living room chair where I'd found her perfume scent lingering, but she looked frail, diminished by the cancer that was already eating away at her. David was kneeling beside her, holding her hand, and both of them were looking directly at the camera with expressions of such profound sadness that I had to turn the page. But the final photo in the album was different. It showed David alone in the house, sitting at this very desk, holding what looked like legal documents. His face was serious, determined, and at the bottom Margaret had written, in handwriting that looked shakier than usual, "David accepts responsibility for Cedar Lane, so grateful he understands what this place means." So, she'd planned it all, the house, the secrecy, David's role as guardian of her hidden life. She'd arranged for her secrets to outlive her, trusting our son to maintain the deception even after she was gone. I thought about the phone call yesterday morning, David's offer to help me clean out the garage. Had he been worried about what I might find? Had he been preparing to remove evidence, to keep protecting secrets that should have died with Margaret? The sun was setting by the time I finished going through the desk. I'd found bank statements showing that David had been making regular deposits to cover the house's expenses, property tax payments made from his own account, utility bills forwarded to his apartment. He'd been managing this property completely on his own for 3 years, spending his own money to maintain Margaret's secret refuge. But why? What was he getting from this arrangement that made it worth the expense, the deception, the elaborate effort required to keep me from finding out? I locked the house and drove home through the suburban evening, past other families living what appeared to be straightforward lives, in houses that held no hidden rooms or secret purposes. The drive gave me time to think about the boy David had been and the man he'd become, but I still couldn't bridge the gap between the reserved but honest child I remembered and the adult who had been lying to me for years. Back home, I made my usual solitary dinner and ate it standing at the kitchen counter, but the routine felt hollow now. How many nights had I stood here while Margaret was ostensibly at a book club meeting or visiting her sister, when she'd actually been at the Cedar Lane house, living some version of herself that didn't include me? How many times had David declined dinner invitations or canceled weekend plans because he'd been helping her maintain her secret life? The house felt different now, charged with the knowledge of what it wasn't. It wasn't the complete picture of our family that I'd thought it was. It was just one part of a more complex story, the public face of relationships that had private dimensions I'd never suspected. I found myself wandering through the rooms, looking at familiar objects with new eyes. The family photos on the mantelpiece seemed like props now, carefully chosen images designed to create an impression of intimacy and sharing. The furniture Margaret had selected, the decorations she'd arranged, even the meals we'd shared at the kitchen table, everything felt like it might have been performance, a role she'd played while saving her authentic self for the house on Cedar Lane. Had she been happy here? In the early years of our marriage, I'd thought so. She had seemed content with our suburban life, pleased with the routines we'd established, satisfied with the quiet predictability of our days together. But maybe I'd been seeing what I'd wanted to see, interpreting her cooperation as contentment when it had actually been resignation. Maybe she'd bought the Cedar Lane house not as an addition to our life together, but as an escape from it. The thought was almost unbearable, but I forced myself to consider it honestly. What if our marriage had become something she'd needed to recover from? What if David had recognized this long before I had, and had chosen to help her create the sanctuary she'd needed, rather than force her to admit that our family wasn't working the way it was supposed to? It would explain the secrecy, the careful planning, the way they'd both protected me from knowing what they'd both apparently understood. That the life I'd thought we were all sharing had been, at least partly, an illusion I'd maintained while they'd quietly built something more authentic somewhere else. I went to bed that night in the bedroom I'd shared with Margaret for 37 years, but it felt like sleeping in a museum exhibit about a marriage that might never have existed the way I'd remembered it. The empty space beside me seemed larger than usual, filled not just with Margaret's absence, but with the ghost of questions I should have asked, while there was still time to hear her answers. Tomorrow I would have to decide what to do with what I'd learned. Tomorrow, I would have to figure out how to confront David about his role in maintaining Margaret's secrets. But tonight, I lay in the dark and tried to remember the last time I'd seen Margaret truly happy in this house, the last time David had seemed genuinely glad to be here. And I realized, with the kind of clarity that comes too late to be useful, that it had been years since either of them had looked at home in the life I'd thought we were all building together. Maybe the Cedar Lane house hadn't been Margaret's betrayal of our marriage. Maybe it had been her gift to herself, and to David, and in some strange way even to me, a place where they could be honest about what our family had become, while allowing me to keep believing in what I'd needed it to be. The question was, what was I supposed to do with that gift now that I finally understood what it was? I called Harold Brennan at 9 o'clock Monday morning. Harold had been our family lawyer for over 20 years, handling our wills, the house purchase, and various minor legal matters that had come up over the decades. He was semi-retired now, but he'd told me after Margaret's funeral to call if I ever needed anything. "Frank," he said when his secretary put me through, "good to hear from you. How are you holding up?" "I've been better, Harold. I need some legal advice about a property matter." There was a pause. Harold had handled Margaret's estate, which should have included all her property holdings. "What kind of property matter?" "It seems Margaret owned a house I didn't know about. I just discovered it, and I'm trying to understand what my legal position is." Another pause, longer this time. "Frank, when we probated Margaret's will, we did a thorough asset search. Are you sure about this?" "I'm sitting in the house right now." That got his attention. We arranged to meet at his office that afternoon. Harold's law firm occupied the second floor of a converted Victorian house downtown, the kind of small-town practice that handled everything from divorces to property disputes to the occasional criminal case. His office hadn't changed much in the 20 years I'd known him. The same heavy wooden desk, the same diplomas and certificates on the walls, the same smell of old leather and coffee. But Harold himself looked older than I remembered, Retirement hadn't been kind to him. He seemed smaller somehow, more fragile. When I spread the Cedar Lane documents across his desk, he put on his reading glasses and examined them with the careful attention of someone whose eyes weren't as sharp as they used to be. "This is unusual," he said finally. "The property was purchased in '94, you said. That would have been during your marriage, which means under California law, it should have been community property, unless there was a specific agreement otherwise. I never signed any such agreement. And you never knew about the purchase?" "Never. Not until I found these papers in the garage 3 days ago." Harold leaned back in his chair, a gesture I remembered from our previous meetings. It meant he was thinking through legal complexities, weighing options and implications. "Frank, this creates some interesting questions. If Margaret used community funds to purchase this property without your knowledge, that could be considered a breach of fiduciary duty. Spouses have legal obligations to each other when it comes to financial decisions. What does that mean practically? It means you may have claims against the estate that we didn't pursue during probate. More immediately, it means you have clear legal standing to assert ownership of this property." He picked up one of the bank statements, studying the account numbers. "These financial records show regular payments from an account I've never seen. Did Margaret have significant income you weren't aware of?" I shook my head. "We shared everything, or at least I thought we did. She managed our household finances, but we had joint accounts, joint tax returns. I can't see where she would have gotten the money for this without me knowing." Harold made notes on a yellow legal pad, the kind of methodical record-keeping that had made him a good small-town lawyer. "We'll need to do some forensic accounting, track the money flows, see where the funds came from. But, Frank, I have to ask, what's your goal here? Do you want to sell the property, keep it, or are you just trying to understand what happened?" It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself since I'd found the house. What did I want? I want to understand why my wife felt she needed to hide this from me for 15 years. And I want to know what my son's role has been in maintaining the deception. Harold's expression grew more serious. "Your son? David?" I told him about the photos, the evidence that David had been managing the property since Margaret's death, the neighbor's identification of him as the young man who came by regularly. "That complicates things legally," Harold said when I finished. "If David knew about the property and failed to disclose it during probate, that could be considered fraud. He was named as executor of Margaret's estate, which means he had a legal obligation to identify all assets." "What kind of fraud?" "Concealment of assets from the probate court. It's a serious matter, Frank. If we can prove he deliberately hid this property, he could face both civil and criminal liability." The words hit me like a physical blow. Criminal liability. My son could go to jail for protecting his mother's secrets. "I don't want to destroy David's life," I said carefully. "I just want to understand what happened." Harold nodded, but his expression remained grave. "I understand that, Frank. But once we start pulling on these threads, we may not be able to control where they lead. Legal processes have their own momentum." He outlined the steps we could take. A formal asset investigation to determine the full scope of Margaret's hidden holdings, forensic accounting to track the money flows, a petition to reopen the probate case, and potentially, depending on what we found, criminal referrals for David's role in concealing assets. "But Harold," I said, "what if I just want to take control of the property quietly, without involving the courts or creating legal problems for David?" "That depends on how cooperative he's willing to be. If he acknowledges your ownership and transfers any relevant documents or accounts to you, we might be able to handle this as a simple estate correction. But if he resists, or if there are other assets we don't know about yet, we'll need the court's help." I left Harold's office with a manila folder full of legal documents and a growing sense that I was setting forces in motion I might not be able to stop. The law, as Harold had explained it, was less interested in my family's emotional complexities than in the black and white questions of asset disclosure and fiduciary duty. But I wasn't ready to confront David yet. First, I needed to understand the full scope of what Margaret had hidden. I spent the rest of the week conducting my own investigation. I went back to the Cedar Lane house every day, going through files more systematically, looking for clues about how Margaret had financed her secret life. I found records of a savings account I'd never known about, funded by small but regular transfers from our joint checking account. $500 a month, withdrawn as household expenses, but actually diverted to support the Cedar Lane property. For 15 years, Margaret had been skimming money from our shared resources to fund her private refuge. Not large amounts, nothing that would have triggered my attention, but enough to cover the mortgage, utilities, and maintenance on a second home. I also found evidence that the deception had been more elaborate than I'd initially realized. Margaret had maintained a separate identity for her Cedar Lane life, complete with a driver's license in her maiden name, credit cards, even a library card for the Millbrook Township branch. She'd created an entire parallel existence, and David had helped her maintain it. The more I learned, the more I understood that this hadn't been a casual arrangement. It had been a carefully planned and executed strategy, maintained over decades, designed to give Margaret something our marriage apparently couldn't provide. But what exactly that was remained unclear. I found some answers in a journal Margaret had kept in the Cedar Lane house, hidden in the back of the bedroom closet. The entries, dating back to '94, chronicled her growing dissatisfaction with our suburban life. "Frank is a good man," one early entry read, "but he's content with such a small life. Work, home, television, bed. The same routine every day, every week, every year. I feel like I'm disappearing inside this predictability." Another entry, from '98. "David asked me today if I was happy. Such a perceptive boy. I told him I was content, which isn't the same thing. But how do you explain to a child that love and happiness aren't always the same thing?" And later, from 2003, "David understands now why I need this place. He says it's like having a room of your own, somewhere you can be yourself instead of someone's wife or mother. He's right, but it's more than that. It's proof that I still exist as Margaret Patterson, not just as Mrs. Frank Morrison." The journal entries painted a picture of a woman who had felt trapped by the very life I'd thought we were building together. Our suburban routine, our predictable patterns, the quiet contentment I'd mistaken for happiness, all of it had felt like a prison to her. And David had understood this in ways I apparently never had. The final entries, from the months before her death, were the hardest to read. "Frank still doesn't know about Cedar Lane, and I've decided he never should. He's built his identity around being the kind of husband who knows everything about his wife's life. Learning about this place would destroy something in him that I don't have the right to break. Better that he remember me as the woman he thought I was than learn the truth about who I really needed to be. David will take care of everything after I'm gone," he promised. My faithful co-conspirator, protecting both his parents in the only way he knows how. So, that was it. Margaret had sworn David to secrecy, not out of cruelty, but out of what she'd perceived as kindness. She'd wanted to protect my illusions about our marriage, and David had agreed to help her do it. But her kindness felt like condescension now. She'd decided I was too fragile to handle the truth about her dissatisfaction, too inflexible to understand her need for something beyond our shared life. She'd chosen to lie to me for 15 years rather than risk having the conversation that might have saved our marriage. And David had chosen to continue the lie even after her death, spending his own money and time to maintain her secret rather than trust me with the truth. Thursday evening, I called Harold again. "I wanted to move forward with the asset investigation," I told him, "and I want to petition to reopen the probate case. Frank, are you sure? Once we do this, there's no taking it back. David will know what we're doing, and he'll need to get his own lawyer." I'm sure, because I was. Margaret and David had made their choice to protect me from the truth. Now, I was making my choice to protect myself from their protection. "All right then. I'll file the papers tomorrow." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and thought about the conversation I'd need to have with David soon. He'd been calling every Sunday for 3 years, maintaining the careful fiction that we were a normal father and son, dealing with normal grief in normal ways. This Sunday, when he called, I was going to change all that. But first, I had one more piece of business to take care of. I drove back to Cedar Lane and let myself into Margaret's secret house one last time. In the bedroom closet, behind the journal I'd found, was a small fireproof safe I'd noticed but hadn't opened. The combination was Margaret's birthday, a guess, but the right one. Inside the safe were documents that made everything else I'd discovered seem trivial by comparison. A life insurance policy I'd never heard of, worth $200,000, with David listed as the sole beneficiary. Investment accounts in Margaret's maiden name, containing nearly $400,000 in assets that had never been disclosed during probate. And a second will, dated just 3 months before Margaret died, leaving everything associated with her Cedar Lane identity to David, with specific instructions that I was never to be told about any of it. Harold was right. Once you started pulling on threads, you couldn't control where they led. My wife hadn't just hidden a house from me, she'd hidden an entire fortune, and she'd made our son her accomplice in keeping it secret. The legal implications were staggering. The personal implications were worse. I locked the safe and left the house, but this time I didn't lock the front door behind me. Let David discover that his secret was no longer safe. Let him wonder what else I'd found and what I planned to do about it. Because I was done being protected from the truth. The call came on Tuesday morning, earlier than David's usual Sunday schedule. I was in the garage, methodically sorting through the remaining boxes with a deliberateness that had nothing to do with cleaning and everything to do with buying time to think. "Dad?" His voice carried a tension I hadn't heard in years. "We need to talk." "About what?" I kept my tone neutral, though my pulse quickened. "I was at Mom's house yesterday, the Cedar Lane house. I noticed some things had been moved around. So, he'd discovered my visits. I'd been wondering how long it would take." "I see." A long pause. "Dad, I know you've been there. I know you found out about the house." "Yes, I did." Another pause, longer this time. I could almost hear him calculating, trying to determine how much I knew and how much damage control was required. "Can we meet somewhere? Tonight? We should talk about this face to face." "I think that would be a good idea." We arranged to meet at Denny's, the same restaurant where we'd had awkward father-son conversations when he was in high school. Neutral territory for a conversation that was going to be anything but neutral. The rest of the day, I continued my methodical work in the garage while my mind worked through the encounter ahead. I'd spent the weekend reading through Margaret's journal more carefully, studying the financial documents Harold's paralegal had helped me organize, preparing for what felt like a chess match, where I finally understood the rules my opponent had been playing by all along. David was already waiting when I arrived at the restaurant. He'd chosen a booth in the back corner, away from other diners, the kind of spot where private conversations could be conducted without drawing attention. He looked older than I remembered, more worn down, as if the weight of maintaining Margaret's secrets had been taking its toll. "Dad." He stood when I approached, offering an awkward half-embrace that felt more formal than affectionate. "Thanks for coming." We ordered coffee and sat across from each other in silence for a moment. David's hands were folded on the table, his wedding ring catching the fluorescent light. I noticed he wasn't wearing his usual casual confidence. Instead, he looked like someone preparing for a difficult negotiation. "I suppose you want an explanation," he said finally. "That would be a start." He took a deep breath. "Mom made me promise, Dad. Before she died, she made me swear I'd never tell you about Cedar Lane. She was convinced it would hurt you, and she couldn't bear that. So, you've been lying to me for 3 years." "I've been protecting you for 3 years." His voice carried a defensive edge I hadn't expected, just like she asked me to. Protecting me from what exactly? From knowing my wife wasn't happy in our marriage? From understanding that she needed something I wasn't providing? David's expression shifted, becoming more careful. "It wasn't about you not being enough, Dad. It was about her needing space to be herself. The house was her refuge, her place to think and read and just breathe. Her place to hide $400,000 in assets from me." The words hit him like a physical blow. His face went pale, and I saw his hands tighten slightly on his coffee cup. "You found the safe." "I found everything, David. The insurance policy, the investment accounts, the second will. I know about all of it." He was quiet for a long time, staring into his coffee as if it might contain answers to questions he had hoped would never be asked. "She earned that money herself," he said finally. "Freelance editing work, investments she made with her library pension. It was separate from your joint assets. Earned without my knowledge, hidden from our joint tax returns, managed through accounts I never knew existed." I kept my voice level, factual. "That money was acquired during our marriage, David. Legally, it should have been community property." "Legally, maybe, but morally, your mother committed financial fraud, and you've been helping her cover it up even after her death." The harsh words hung between us in the restaurant air. David flinched as if I'd slapped him, but I felt no satisfaction in his pain. This wasn't about hurting him. It was about establishing the reality of what had happened. "Dad, please, you don't understand what she was going through. Then help me understand. Tell me why my wife felt she needed to steal money from our marriage to buy herself a secret life. She didn't steal anything. The words came out louder than he'd intended, drawing glances from other diners. He lowered his voice. She saved that money over years, small amounts, careful investments. She never took anything that would have affected your standard of living. $500 a month for 15 years, David. That's $90,000 she diverted from our household account alone, not counting what she earned secretly or invested without my knowledge. He stared at me, and I could see him recalculating, trying to figure out how much I'd discovered and what other evidence I might have. The point is, I continued, she built an entirely separate financial life without my knowledge or consent, and when she died, you inherited responsibility for hiding it from me. To protect you. To protect yourselves. From having to explain what you'd done. From having to account for the deception. David's face hardened. That's not fair. Isn't it? You've spent 3 years managing property I didn't know I owned. Spending your own money to maintain a house my wife bought, with funds that legally belong to both of us. You handled her estate, and somehow failed to disclose $400,000 in assets to the probate court. You've answered my questions about Mom's affairs for 3 years while knowing you were lying to me about the most significant financial decision of her adult life. I was honoring her wishes. You were committing fraud. The word hung between us like a blade. David's face went through a series of expressions: anger, hurt, fear, resignation, before settling into something that looked almost like relief. So, what do you want, Dad? An apology? The money? Do you want me to grovel? I want the truth, all of it, and I want control of the assets that legally belong to me. He nodded slowly. And if I cooperate, if I help you sort this out quietly, then maybe we can handle this as a family matter instead of a legal case. It wasn't entirely true. I'd already set Harold's investigation in motion, already filed papers to reopen the probate case. But David didn't need to know that yet. What about the house, Cedar Lane? I'd been thinking about this for days. I'm going to sell it. Dad, no, you can't. For the first time in our conversation, he looked genuinely stricken. That house meant everything to Mom. It was her sanctuary, her place to be herself. You can't just sell it like it was any other property. It is any other property. It's a house my wife bought with money she hid from me, and now it's an asset I need to liquidate to recover what was stolen from our marriage. Stolen? Jesus, Dad, listen to yourself. You're talking about Mom like she was some kind of criminal. What would you call it, David? Taking money from joint accounts to fund a secret life? Hiding assets from your spouse? Maintaining false identities and separate financial records? I'd call it survival. His voice was quiet now, tired. I'd call it a woman trying to keep some piece of herself alive in a marriage that was slowly suffocating her. The words stung because they contained enough truth to be devastating, but I couldn't afford to be derailed by emotional arguments. Then she should have talked to me about it. We should have worked together to fix whatever was wrong with our marriage. Would you have listened? Really? David leaned forward, his eyes intense. Dad, you loved the life you two had built. The routine, the predictability, the quiet suburban existence. It made you happy, and you assumed it made her happy too, but it didn't. She felt trapped, diminished, like she was disappearing into your vision of what a good wife should be. So, instead of talking to me, she decided to lie to me for 15 years. She decided to find a way to stay married to you without losing herself completely. And it worked, Dad. She was happier in the last years of her life because she had Cedar Lane. She loved you enough to figure out how to make the marriage work for both of you, even if you never knew what she was doing. I sat back in the booth, studying my son's face. There was conviction there, genuine belief in the righteousness of what he and Margaret had done. But there was also something else, calculation, the look of someone who was still trying to manage the situation, still trying to protect secrets. What else, David? What do you mean? What else haven't you told me? Cedar Lane isn't the only secret, is it? His hesitation was answer enough. Dad, some things are better left buried. I'll be the judge of that. What else? He looked around the restaurant, as if checking to make sure we weren't being overheard, then leaned closer. There are other properties, not just Cedar Lane. The words hit me like ice water. How many others? 2 more. A condo in Palm Springs and a small apartment in San Francisco. She bought them as investments, used the rental income to fund her activities. 3 properties, 3 separate lives my wife had maintained without my knowledge. Rental income that was never reported on our joint tax returns. She filed separately for those, under her maiden name. Tax fraud. My wife had been committing systematic tax fraud for years, and my son had been helping her cover it up. I felt something cold and hard settling in my chest. A kind of angry clarity I hadn't experienced since my construction days, when workers tried to cut corners on safety regulations. This wasn't about marriage problems anymore. This was about criminal activity that my family had been conducting while I'd remained obliviously loyal. David, do you understand what you're telling me? Your mother was operating an illegal financial scheme for years. She was hiding income, maintaining false identities, evading taxes, and committing fraud on a massive scale, and you've been helping her do it. Dad, it wasn't like that. It was exactly like that. Whatever her emotional motivations, whatever problems she had with our marriage, she broke the law repeatedly and systematically, and now you're criminally liable for helping her cover it up. David's face had gone pale again. What are you going to do? I'm going to recover what belongs to me. All of it. And I'm going to make sure the legal record is corrected. And me? I looked at my son, this man I'd raised, who had grown up to become someone capable of maintaining elaborate deceptions for years. Someone who could sit across from me and in with apparent sincerity while calculating what truths he could afford to reveal. That depends on how cooperative you are in making this right. We sat in silence for several minutes. David stared out the restaurant window at the parking lot, and I could see him working through his options, trying to figure out how to minimize the damage to himself. I need time to think, he said finally. You have until Friday. Either you help me sort this out voluntarily, or my lawyer handles it through the courts. And if I cooperate, then maybe we can keep this in the family. It was the second lie I'd told him that evening, but David had been lying to me for 3 years, and Margaret had been lying to me for 15. I figured I was entitled to a little strategic deception of my own. We left the restaurant without resolving anything, but the balance of power had shifted decisively. David now knew that I knew everything, and he understood that his legal exposure was significant. More importantly, he understood that I was no longer the naive, trusting father he'd been manipulating. Driving home through the suburban streets where I'd lived what I'd thought was an honest life, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of finally understanding the rules of the game I'd been playing. Margaret and David had spent years being careful architects of deception. Now it was my turn to be a careful architect of something else. Not revenge, exactly. Justice might be too strong a word, but accountability. Definitely accountability. And if that process happened to cause them some of the pain they had caused me by their years of careful lies, well, that seemed like a reasonable price for them to pay. Friday was 3 days away. That gave me time to make sure I was fully prepared for whatever David decided to do, and to make sure that whatever happened next, I was the one controlling the situation instead of being controlled by it. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like I had a purpose beyond just getting through each day. It felt surprisingly good. David didn't call on Friday. I waited until 6 in the evening, then called Harold's office and left a message. Proceed with everything we discussed. Full investigation, criminal referrals if warranted, complete asset recovery. Then I sat in my kitchen and microwaved another solitary dinner. But for the first time in months, the silence didn't feel oppressive. It felt expectant, like the quiet before a storm that's been building for too long. Saturday morning, David's car appeared in my driveway. I watched from the kitchen window as he sat behind the wheel for several minutes, apparently gathering courage or working out what he was going to say. When he finally got out, he moved with the careful deliberation of someone who knew he was walking into hostile territory. Dad? He stood on my front porch, not presuming to enter uninvited. We need to finish our conversation. I let him in, but we stayed in the living room, instead of moving to the kitchen, where we'd had so many of our awkward father-son talks over the years. This wasn't that kind of conversation anymore. I've been thinking about what you said, he began, settling into Margaret's old chair, a choice that struck me as either unconsciously ironic or deliberately provocative. About cooperation. And I'll give you access to everything, all the accounts, all the properties, all the records Mom kept. I'll sign whatever papers your lawyer needs to transfer everything back to your control." It was what I'd asked for, but something in his tone made me cautious. In exchange for what? "I want the Cedar Lane house." "David." "Hear me out." He held up a hand. "I'll help you liquidate the other properties, sort out the tax issues, deal with all the legal complications, but I want to buy Cedar Lane from you. Fair market value, clean transaction, everything properly recorded." I studied his face. "Why is that house so important to you?" "Because it's where I learned who my mother really was. It's where she was happiest, where she felt most like herself. And it's where she trusted me with the truth about her feelings, about what she needed from life that she wasn't getting at home." The words stung, but I kept my expression neutral. "The house represents her betrayal of our marriage, David. Why would you want to preserve that?" "It represents her survival of a marriage that wasn't working for her. There's a difference." "Is there?" "From where I sit, it looks like an elaborate lie that cost our family hundreds of thousands of dollars and 15 years of honest communication." David leaned forward in Margaret's chair, his hands clasped in front of him. "Dad, can I ask you something? In all those years, did you ever once ask Mom if she was happy? Really happy, not just content with the routines you had established?" The question caught me off guard. Of course she was happy. We had a good life, a stable marriage. You had the marriage you wanted. That doesn't mean she did. If she wasn't happy, she should have told me. We could have worked on it, made changes. "Could you have? Really?" David's voice was gentle but insistent. "Think about it honestly, Dad. If Mom had come to you 15 years ago and said she was feeling suffocated by your suburban routine, that she needed more independence, more space to be herself, what would you have done?" I opened my mouth to answer, then stopped. The truth was, I didn't know. The Margaret who'd expressed those feelings would have been a stranger to me. I'd built my understanding of our marriage on the assumption that she shared my contentment with the life we'd created together. "You would have tried to fix her," David continued. "You would have suggested counseling, or a hobby, or maybe a vacation. You would have approached her dissatisfaction like a problem to be solved rather than a truth to be accepted. And that would have been wrong? It would have been you, Dad, which wasn't what she needed." We sat in silence for several minutes. Outside, I could hear a neighbor mowing his lawn, the familiar Saturday morning sound of suburban maintenance, the kind of predictable routine that had apparently driven Margaret to create an entirely separate life. "So, she chose deception instead of honesty," I said finally. "She chose survival instead of destruction. If she'd told you the truth about how trapped she felt, it would have destroyed something in you that she didn't want to break. Your image of yourself as a good husband, your belief in the marriage you thought you'd built together. She loved you enough to protect those illusions. By lying to me for 15 years, by finding a way to stay married to you without completely losing herself." David stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the yard where Margaret had tended her roses for 4 decades. "Dad, she could have left you. She could have demanded a divorce, taken half of everything, started over somewhere else. Instead, she found a way to make the marriage work by creating space for the parts of herself that didn't fit your vision of who she should be. And you helped her do it. I helped her stay your wife. I helped her remain the woman you fell in love with, at least in the ways that mattered to you." I wanted to argue with his logic, but I could feel the uncomfortable truth in what he was saying. If Margaret had revealed her dissatisfaction 15 years ago, would I have been able to change? Would I have been willing to give up the comfortable routines, the predictable patterns, the quiet suburban existence that had made me feel successful as a husband and provider? Or would I have tried to convince her that what we had was good enough, that contentment was a reasonable substitute for happiness, that asking for more was ungrateful or unrealistic? The money, David, even if I accept your explanation for the emotional deception, she still committed financial fraud. She earned that money through work you didn't know about, and she saved it in accounts that never affected your standard of living. She wasn't stealing from you, Dad. She was creating independence for herself. Independence built on lies. Independence built on necessity. David turned from the window to face me. "Dad, do you know what she wrote in her journal the day after your 40th wedding anniversary?" I shook my head. "She wrote that you spent the entire dinner talking about how proud you were of the life you'd built together, how grateful you were for her partnership in creating such a stable, comfortable existence. And she realized that you genuinely had no idea she was dying inside that life. The words hit me like a physical blow. I remembered that anniversary dinner, the restaurant downtown where we'd celebrated so many special occasions. I'd been feeling particularly reflective that night, grateful for the predictable happiness of our long marriage. She wrote that listening to you talk about your contentment made her understand that her unhappiness wasn't your fault. You weren't deliberately trying to diminish her. You just needed different things from marriage than she did, and you'd built a life that worked perfectly for you. So, she decided to build a different life that worked for her. She decided to build a compromise that let both of you have what you needed without forcing either of you to give up what made you happy. David sat back down, this time on the couch rather than in Margaret's chair. Dad, I'm not saying what she did was right or wrong. I'm saying it was what she felt she had to do to survive. And it worked. You had 15 more years of the marriage you wanted, and she had 15 years of breathing room. I thought about the photos I'd seen in the Cedar Lane house, Margaret looking relaxed and genuine in ways I hadn't seen in our shared life. Had she been performing for me all those years, maintaining a version of herself that matched my expectations while saving her authentic self for somewhere else? And now you want to preserve that compromise by buying her refuge. I want to honor what she created there, the version of herself she was able to maintain because she had that space. What about honoring our marriage? What about the 47 years we spent building a life together? Dad, you still have that. Nothing about Cedar Lane changes the fact that she loved you, that she chose to stay married to you, that she spent 47 years as your partner. The house was just an addition to that partnership, not a replacement for it. I stood up and walked to the mantelpiece, looking at the family photos that had suddenly taken on new meaning. Our wedding picture, David's graduation, anniversaries and holidays, and ordinary moments that had felt like the complete story of our family life. But they were just the public story, weren't they? The version of our life that I'd needed to see, while the private story was being lived elsewhere, in a house I'd never known existed. If I sell you Cedar Lane, what happens to the other properties? We liquidate them, exactly as you want. Clean transactions, proper tax filings, complete disclosure to the IRS. I'll take full responsibility for any penalties or legal consequences. And the money? Goes to you, minus what I pay for Cedar Lane. It's your money, Dad. It always was. I turned to look at my son, this man who had spent 3 years lying to me, but who genuinely seemed to believe he'd been protecting me. What makes you think I'd trust you to handle any of this honestly? Because you don't have a choice. I'm the only one who knows where all the accounts are, how the properties are managed, what Mom's system was. You need my cooperation to sort this out. And I need your agreement to keep Cedar Lane. It was a reasonable negotiation, and David was right about my limited options. I could force everything through the courts, but that would take years and cost a fortune in legal fees. It would also expose our family's dysfunction to public scrutiny and potentially result in David facing criminal charges. I have conditions, I said finally. Name them. First, you pay fair market value for Cedar Lane, determined by an independent appraisal. No family discount. Agreed. Second, you handle all the legal and tax complications from the other properties. Any penalties, any back taxes, any criminal liability, that's your responsibility. Agreed. Third, you never lie to me again. About anything. Ever. David was quiet for a long moment. That's going to be harder than the other two. Why? Because sometimes the truth hurts people unnecessarily. Sometimes protecting someone from painful information is an act of love. Let me worry about what I can handle, David. Your job is to be honest with me. Even if that honesty damages our relationship has already been damaged. The only question is whether we can build something new based on truth, instead of the lies that have been holding it together. David nodded slowly. All right, complete honesty from now on. Starting now, is there anything else you haven't told me? Any other secrets? Any other deceptions? Anything else I'm going to discover that will make me feel like a fool? He looked down at his hands, and I knew there was more. Dad, there's something else about Mom's last few months. Something she asked me to promise. What? She knew she was sicker than she let on. Sicker than she told you. She could have fought longer, tried more aggressive treatments. But She chose not to. The room seemed to tilt around me. What are you saying? I'm saying she decided when she'd had enough. And she asked me not to tell you because she knew you'd want to keep fighting, keep hoping, keep pushing for treatments that would only prolong her suffering. Margaret had chosen to die rather than continue living the life we'd built together. The realization hit me like a physical blow. She made me promise to let you believe she'd fought as hard as she could, that the cancer was just too aggressive. But the truth is, she chose to let go. I sat down heavily in my recliner, the chair where I'd spent so many evenings since Margaret's death, believing I was grieving the loss of someone who'd been taken from me too soon. She didn't want you to feel like you'd failed her, David continued. She wanted you to remember her as the woman who'd loved the life you'd built together, not as someone who had chosen to escape from it. Even in death, Margaret had been protecting me from truths she'd decided I couldn't handle, and David had been maintaining that protection for 3 years. Is that everything? My voice sounded distant, mechanical. That's everything. We sat in the living room, where Margaret and I had shared so many quiet evenings, but the silence felt different now, heavier, charged with the weight of truths that had been carefully hidden and were now being reluctantly revealed. I'll have Harold Ed draw up the papers for the Cedar Lane sale, I said finally. And the other properties? We'll handle those together, honestly this time. David stood to leave, pausing at the front door. Dad, for what it's worth, she really did love you. Everything she did, all the secrets, all the deception. It was because she loved you enough to want to spare you the pain of knowing how trapped she felt. I know, I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it yet. After he left, I sat alone in the house that had been our shared refuge but had apparently also been Margaret's prison. The family photos on the mantelpiece looked different now. Not false exactly, but incomplete. They showed the version of our family that I'd needed to see, while the fuller truth had been carefully hidden elsewhere. Outside, the neighbor was still mowing his lawn, maintaining the suburban perfection that had made me feel successful as a husband and homeowner. But now, I wondered how many other houses on our street contained similar secrets, similar compromises, similar elaborate arrangements designed to let people stay married while secretly living entirely different lives. I thought about calling Harold to cancel the legal proceedings, but decided against it. The asset recovery would still need to happen, the tax issues would still need to be resolved, but the vindictive satisfaction I had been anticipating had evaporated, replaced by something more complicated and harder to define. Margaret had lied to me for 15 years, but she'd done it to protect something she'd valued in me. David had maintained those lies for 3 years, but he'd done it to honor her wishes and shield me from truths that would have changed how I remembered our marriage. They'd both chosen to sacrifice honesty for what they'd perceived as kindness. I still wasn't sure if that made their deception better or worse. But I was beginning to understand why they'd made the choices they had. The house felt different as evening settled over the suburban street. Not emptier, it had been empty for 3 years, but quieter in a different way, as if secrets that had been whispering in the walls had finally been spoken aloud and could now rest. Tomorrow, David and I would begin the complicated process of untangling Margaret's hidden life and integrating it with the life I'd thought we'd been living together. We'd sort through financial records, deal with lawyers and tax accountants, transform her carefully maintained deceptions into legally documented truths. But tonight, I would sit in this house where I'd been happy for 47 years and try to decide whether learning the truth about that happiness made it more valuable or less. Outside, the lawnmower fell silent, and the suburban evening settled into its familiar quiet patterns. Somewhere across town, David was probably sitting in his own apartment, wondering whether he had made the right choice in finally telling me everything. And somewhere else entirely, a house sat empty on Cedar Lane, waiting to be sold to the son who understood its true value better than the husband who'd never known it existed. The silence that followed truth, I was learning, was different from the silence that followed secrets. It was harder to bear, but also somehow more honest. For the first time in 3 years, I was living in a house where I knew, finally, what the silence really meant.